I will first offer you a pro tip for Space Invaders. This wasn't in my prepared remarks. But if you're playing Space Invaders, don't go back and forth crazy. Shoot them in columns at the end. They go slower that way. So if you want to break the high score, you can do that later. Thank you, Jan, very much for inviting me here. Thank you for all the people who've been so generous with their time and with coordinating logistics and getting me over here from the US. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time to Australia, and having a wonderful time so far. And I'm sort of an accidental archivist here, so I'm not sure if I'm the best person to be speaking here about this, but I'll share a little about our experiences. As you see, it says mistakes made, lessons learned. We've made plenty of mistakes along the way, and we still continue to make mistakes. I think everyone does who's in this business. Just as some personal background, which may inform some of the sort of approaches you'll see. I'm first of all the son of a Roman archaeologist, so you'll see some classical allusions in there that probably reflect that. My mom just sent me a slide of me standing in an amphitheater in Susa, Italy, near Switzerland, of saluting my older brother. And I think I was reciting, we were about to die, salute you. So that says something about sibling relationships, I think. But I've drawn in those. And then I went to college actually to be a computer science major because I loved programming early computers, early microcomputers, mainframes, but discovered I was not that good a programmer. I was better at programming games, and so I ended up as a historian doing 19th century intellectual cultural history. And so that background, though, has proved to be useful because as a museum, we sort of, too, stumbled into video games. Now, a show of hands, before you saw the program, how many people had heard of the Strong National Museum of Play? Okay, so a few. And how many people have actually been there? Okay, so a few, too. So we're in Rochester, New York, which if you come to New York City, just plan on driving another 6.5 hours north, and you'll get to Rochester. And we are a museum dedicated to play. As Jan said, we get about 600,000 guests a year that come to the museum. And it's a very highly interactive museum where we really try to blend artifacts and interpretation and interactives all in one experience. And my role there, as Jan said, is I'm in charge of the exhibits, so coming up with the ideas of those, developing those, maintaining them. 600,000 people a year are pretty hard on exhibits. And also in charge of the video game section. And there's proved to be a wonderful synergy between the two because developing exhibits turns out to be a lot like developing games. And so I've learned from both aspects of my job. They've each sort of helped me understand the other one better. I've been there 21 years, and during that time, I've seen the growth of the collection. So we have the world's most comprehensive collection of materials related to play. So that includes things like up here, if I can. So this is the prototype for Monopoly right here. It's round, as you can see. It was done by Charles Darrow. Actually, it was based on an earlier game by a woman named Lizzie Magie called The Landlord's Game, which was actually a critique of monopoly and great wealth. Not surprisingly, Lizzie Magie was written out of the history. Parker Brothers basically literally paid her off, and we have on display a memo that says not for publication on there, telling them their true history. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1970s. And we have a copy of The Landlord's Game there as well, but this was actually something Charles Darrow created during the Great Depression. You'll see this slide will reoccur. That's some of our arcade games. This is Thomas Edison's talking doll. And we have amazing archives, and I'll talk about those a little bit. This is from Sid Saxon, who was the first full-time board game developer in the United States. And I always throw the mystery date game in there. I don't know if that made it to Australia or not. But it's a wonderful piece of cultural history because the norms of male attractiveness have been completely reversed since the 1960s. So you would open a little door and find out if you got a dream or a dud. And it's completely opposite. The dreams then would be the duds today. So I sort of, and it's important to look at this collection because our efforts really grew out of the fact that we are a play museum. And I think that's one of the things about anyone who does digital preservation is that your efforts are going to be intensely local in many ways. They're going to be conform to the standards, to the needs, to the goals of your museum or your library or your archive. And so I want to share some of our particular experiences, and I've tried to maybe generalize from those some larger lessons, which may or may not be applicable to you. I can only speak from my personal experience. But we have the International Center for the History of Electronic Games, which is something I'll talk about its origin. And you'll see it's established in 2009. Preserves and explores the global history of video games. We use the term electronic games because it's the broadest term that we could think of. Video games, there are text-based games, for instance. If you use digital games, there are some games that really have more of an analog tradition. In many ways, Pong is in many ways an analog game. Jan already mentioned our video game collection and archival collections. And the archival collections, I'm not going to go into that too much. If you go to our website, you can look, but it's from key developers. People like Ralph Baer, who patented the idea of playing a video game on television. Will Wright, who created The Sims. Roberta and Ken Williams, who were the founders of Sierra. And also key companies. So Atari, for instance, which was a major video game company in the 1970s. We have Atari's coin-op business collections that literally came in a whole tractor-trailer load and kept archivists busy for a couple of years with that. It was good job security. And we do these because we want to preserve the history both for now, but also going forward. And our thesis is that video games are the most transformative medium of the 21st century. Now, obviously, they have roots going back earlier, and I'm sure people, especially with the revival of television or with web, might say something differently, but it's what we say, so we go with it. But we really do, video games are having a transformative impact in the way we learn, the way we play, the way we relate to one another. And so we want to document that history. And so we do that so that 100 years from now, people can understand that history as well. We have the World Video Game Hall of Fame, which opened in 2015, and that recognizes key games. There are now 24 games in there that really stand out in the basis of icon status, influence, longevity, and geographical reach. And that's an important sort of, I'd say, marketing tool in some ways for us, a way to bring the importance of video games to a much wider attention. And we create major interactive exhibits. I'll talk about those a little bit at the end if I have time. I threw some extra slides in right before the talk just to show you those. And then we're also in the middle of a major $65 million expansion. So the museum itself is 285,000 square feet. So it's about, 26,500 square meters or so. And we're adding a lot more. And a lot of that will be focused on video game materials. So as a theme, I don't know if people are familiar with Sid Meier. He's a prominent video game designer. Sid Meier's Civilization is one of the sort of classic games. And he has a theory of game design, which says that game design is a series of interesting decisions, and that the role of the game designer is to create situations for the player have to choose something in some way that's compelling. I sort of thought I'd riff off this a little bit and think about digital preservation as a series of interesting challenges. And to me, so much of what we do, or at least, again, based on my experience, has not been something that could have been planned from the beginning. It's something that you solve one problem, or you undertake one initiative, and that creates a whole other set of challenges. And it's that process of coming up with solutions to those challenges. In that way, then you come up with new approaches, new models, new ways of doing things, of organizing your institution. And so it's something that really, I think, forces you to live moment by moment, even as you're planning for the long term. But I want to make this clear, and again, some of this reflects the fact that I am not generally the one doing the technical work of archiving. In the beginning, I did some of that, the migration of data or the caring for the machines. But for me, a lot of my roles is I see that digital preservation is always as much about these larger issues of business management, mission, resource, that you can only do the technical item sort of matters of preservation if you've solved these other issues, if you've made a compelling case for these other issues. And I was at the roundtable this morning, and that was a theme that I think really came up. How do you get funding for things? How do you make choices in everything you're doing? And so That's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of how we approach some of these issues going forward. If you have specific technical issues, I'm happy to try to answer those, or else connect you with colleagues who probably can answer it better than I can in many ways. But for this, I want to talk about this as a sort of a story of our organization. And it's one that started with us choosing not to do anything with video games. So my CEO is retired, so I can now print this, share this email with you. And I should say he really was a visionary leader, really transformed the museum, and talk about later was really key in us eventually getting into video games. But in 1999, I'd been at the museum all of a year, and we had this opportunity to get the Videotopia exhibit, which was a traveling exhibit of arcade games. And we talked a lot about it, and at the time we were not focused on play as a mission. And so you see here that there was a lot of institutional skepticism about video games. It feels a little weird now because there's so many institutions now are doing this to think, well, why wouldn't you do video games? It's a sure way to generate attention. But I think it raised a good question. What is the relationship of what you're doing to your mission? What's your relationship to your audience? And will you be able to sustain that audience after you do this one-time initiative? Is it a one-time initiative? And so he brought this to our board of trustees and to the executive committee, and they chose not to pursue video games. At the time, our mission was to look at American cultural and social history through 3 lenses, that of progress, identity, and class. And it was hard to figure out where video games fit in that. So we said, no, we're not going to do that. Shortly after that, we had 2 key moments for the institution. In 2003, after a long period of study, we adopted our play mission. The museum itself had opened in 1982. Its first mission was the impact of industrialization on everyday American life from 1820 to 1940, which was not a mission that brought in the masses. And the museum went through a series of changes, including creating exhibits that were much more interactive. And the result was, in 2003, we adopted this mission to focus on play, which was really where the core of our collections were, and should have been the mission of the museum from the very beginning. The museum itself was the result of the bequest of Margaret Woodbury Strong, who was a passionate collector, especially of dolls and toys, but other things as well, and she left the funds to help it. In 2006, we completed a major expansion, which about doubled the size of the museum. And so we were at an opportune moment to look now, what's next? And when we adopted the play mission, we realized that we couldn't talk about play, and we established, for instance, a journal, the American Journal Play at the same time, without talking about video games, because you had this collection of toys and dolls and board games, and yet video games were having this transformative effect on play. And literally, I think we had about 5 items in the collection that related to video games: an Atari 2600, an early microcomputer with some games in it. And it was not bringing it the attention that play deserved. And so we said, okay, let's go ahead and do this. So this is where I'm going to try to wax profound, and probably not, but at these different moments. So I think it always needs to be related to your mission, that whatever, if you're doing digital preservation, unless it's related to your mission and your strategic plan and your vision, is not going to stick. And you're not going to effectively be able to gather the resources you need from other stakeholders outside your institution, let alone inside your institution, which itself is a battle sometimes. So 2006, I got asked to lead the effort to begin collecting video games. I sort of joke, it's like I had a little bit, as I shared a little background in computer science, and I played video games my whole life, and I also was about 15 years younger than anyone else in any position to do anything about it. So I think they thought, okay, he can do video games. So, and actually, a lot of institutions have this sort of accidental thing that happens. There's someone on staff who understands them or whatever. And so one of the first things I did was I sat down and wrote a long framework for collecting, interpreting, and exhibiting electronic games, which was sort of a white paper. What would this mean? And as I was going back and preparing this talk, one of the things I noticed was I say nothing about preservation in there. It's like, I didn't even think about it. That's why I say I'm an accidental archivist. It was like, let's bring this stuff in, and we didn't really think about what would that mean. Now, we had a conservation staff who cared for our dolls and our toys and other things, but we really didn't think about digital preservation, and I'm not sure if we had thought about everything it meant, we would have plunged forward. We would have like, oh, it's too much or something like that. I don't know. So that was one of the early lessons or mistakes I think I made, is not thinking about that. and that we made. Furthermore, at the time, there weren't really a lot of models for how do you do video game history. So I drew on my own background. I'd done a lot of work in history of the book and history of science, and thought, okay, we need to take a wide-angle lens to this. This needs to be about more than just the games themselves. So I did this diagram, and this is online. Actually, a lot of that, part of that white paper is online as well, right here. If you, I think if you search concentric circles, you'll find it. And that was, part of it sort of feels really dated, so I'm sort of embarrassed some of it's on there too. But you thought about, for us as an institution, how do we want to look at video games? And so thought about it first as the games themselves, then as the producers, then as the players, and then all within the circle of play itself. Now, your institution may have a very different set of circles there, or a very different way of looking at it. This was what we chose, and a lot of this grew out of this sense of, for instance, with the history of the book. One of the things that had become clear to me is that historians shifted from being interested first in history of the text, for instance, to wanting to know more about the author and the drafts, to eventually thinking about what is a reader? What is reader response like? Well, what would a player response be like? What is player culture like? These are the questions that have sort of animated us as we've gone forward, and some of these have proved to be much more easy to collect. Games were the easiest to collect in many ways. But as I know is happening here, working with developers, that requires more effort in many ways to go out to cultivate these relationships. And what does it mean to collect from the players? How do you do that? And then play it within the medium of play. How does this relate to older forms of play? So I think this is something that we found very valuable, was to have some sort of plan that answers the why, how, when questions. And then doing what I didn't do, which was begin to articulate a plan for tackling digital preservation. And of course, as with all plans, they're roadmaps, not blueprints. Be prepared to throw them out if you want. So we started with a vision, and we were saying, oh, we may only have 5 games, but it's okay. We're going to dream big here. So it sounds sort of arrogant as I put it up there in big print, but we thought we want to be the premier institution for the interpretation, collection, and exhibition of electronic games through the lens of play. And I think that last little codicil there is important because we weren't going to do everything with video games necessarily. We want to look at it through the lens of play. But there's this term that our CEO at the time was fond of, BHAGs. Have people heard of this at all? Jim Collins, business guru, sort of wrote it, big, hairy, audacious goals. Think big. So I don't know what your situation is, but think big, I would say, because as most of us find out, you generally think big, you end up farther along than if you think small sometimes, and you only get so far. And this was for us a big, hairy, audacious goal. And I remember going out to, for instance, the Game Developers Conference. And I'll let you in on a little secret. Rochester is nowhere anywhere in the map of the game development world. And so, why Rochester? Why Rochester? And so, no matter where you are, what your situation, I think there's an opportunity to really achieve ambitious things. So I would urge you to think big, whatever you're doing. But again, know what you're not. So we realized quickly we were not a computer museum. So we could not collect every computer that was made that could have been used to play a video game on. It didn't make sense for us to do that. We didn't have the capacity to do it. So make those strategic choices about what you're not doing as well as what you are doing. So then in 2009, by then we had built the collection up to about 20,000 video games or so. And we said, okay, we need to make a center here, something to give it some grounding. And so we launched the National Center for the History of Electronic Games, and we did this really cheesy photo here that got a lot of attention and is like violates every rule of sort of how to properly care for artifacts. But it was, again, this is honest. This is not being recorded, right? Yeah, no, okay, good. We realized it was a dumb decision called the National Center for the History of Electronic Games because video games are so international. There's no way that you can talk about video games and only keep it in one domestic context. Now, the reason is we recently changed our name to the National Museum of Play, and so there are logical reasons, but we thought, okay, we need to do this in a way that recognizes the international nature of video games. And so one of the first things we did was to open the Videotopia exhibit, which the board had rejected, I guess, actually 10 years earlier or so. And we actually got it out of mothballs. It was in a warehouse, so sort of deep in bat guano and help restore the games. And we opened this exhibit, and then we actually purchased the whole exhibit. So our vice president for collections wasn't necessarily thrilled to have 114 arcade games immediately dumped into our storage. Luckily, we just built some new storage. But it was a big hit with our guests, and it matched the mission we had adopted. So we did that. These are some of the type of game. Computer Space, the first arcade game. Pong, most or Pac-Man. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the sort of what it means to care for an object like this. I love the Pong, had the original loaf pan used for baking bread that was the original coin receiver in there that they just put in there that came with it. But we quickly realized we had no idea how to fix, well, actually, we realized when we had the exhibit, we need to develop expertise with this. And so there had been someone who came with the show who would fix the machines, but then he would stay there for a little while, and then he'd hear about a rare arcade game somewhere in Oklahoma, and he'd disappear, and we'd be left with arcade games that weren't working anymore. And there's nothing worse than something that doesn't work to annoy your guests. So we had to develop expertise. So that meant hiring someone to fix these games. Well, once, as you know, you start devoting resources to things, you need to have a way to fund these. So we started charging tokens. So we still do. We use the money. We're still 5 tokens for $1, though I think it's going to go up to 4 tokens for $1 soon. We made our own custom tokens. I just saw one on sale on eBay Canada for about $3. So I'm not sure why. It wasn't a museum employee making any money, I don't think, either. So, but we needed a way to finance caring for these. And I think that's one of those things that we talk about with digital preservation. Again, a theme that came up in this morning's roundtable. Digital preservation of any kind is expensive. And it's only going to get more so as we go into storing things in the cloud, or to things that require being maybe migrated from one platform to another every so many years. There's a long tail of costs there that needs to be accounted for. So we needed to find a way to support that. And that's been an ongoing issue going forward. We also needed to figure out overcome a lot of challenges there. So for instance, we had to stock up on CRTs. And there was, no one really makes cathode ray tubes anymore. And so we found someone who had like 30 or so CRTs. So when we couldn't rebuild them, we could replace them. We've bought a couple of shipments like that. So that's part of our long-term digital preservation strategy is storehousing these. Yeah, and then little things like making sure that the batteries are taken out of games. This is true for arcade games and other things as well. And that's where it's helped to have a whole conservation team that could bring their expertise in from traditional artifacts into this. We also had to figure out what sort of model we're going to do this. So we wanted to make this available for guests to play. So we came up with this term, or we had come up with this term previously, actually, before me, which is a term called usefacts, which is an artifact that you can use. It's a very complicated term there, I guess. And thinking about this, I was just at the is it Australian National Museum here, and they have the ferry boat behind, which is an artifact part of their collection. It's the same idea. So we had this 1918 Herschel carousel, which was actually an artifact in our collection. And so we said, well, what if we take the same idea and say our arcade games will be artifacts that we can use, that guests will be able to use. Now, we had tried putting some other artifacts out, like an Atari 2600 joystick, an original one, and it lasted about 2 days before it broke. But artifacts were meant to be played in public, and so we said, okay, we're going to designate these as usefacts, unless, I'm going to go back to this, unless they're part of what we term our restricted collection. So every artifact that comes in, we say, okay, arcade game, is it going to be part of the general collection, or is it going to be in the restricted collection? And even within the restricted collection, there are these layers. Could it be used by a researcher who's coming to play the game? Could it be used to videotape it? Is it for display only? And that is sort of our way to determine what things are going in the general collection versus what things are going in the restricted collection. It gets marked in the computer database and also with a physical tag. And just to go back to this, I think the example of the UseFacts, to me, is, again, this is something that you probably all know from your own experience as well. We use existing models that work for your institution for digital preservation. Now, the downside of this, I think, is what happens when we all try to collaborate. We all have our individual models that work for us, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for other institutions, or how do we bring them together? And so that's something that is a downside of that, but something I think is inevitable. And for arcade preservation, we then said, well, okay, we're going to look at arcade games the way you might look at historic architecture. There is a history here. So this is Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, as it was when the Ladies' Society of Mount Vernon decided to restore it. And they chose to restore it to this idealized version of George Washington's home. There's a whole lived history that existed afterwards. What about that? And so you make these decisions with architectural preservation, and the same thing for us with arcade games. You keep that cigarette burn that's from the time it was at a bar or something like that. So a couple examples of this. So this is actually a home computer. This is an Altair. The person put this black tape here to sort of soften the edges a little bit. Space War. You'll see right here. This is the notice from the arcade where it was. We're going to leave that on there. This Touch Me is a more interesting example. That's actually the game, if any of you know the game Simon, which was a memory game. This was a game that inspired it, but these buttons are not original to the game. They actually were meant to look like a later Simon game that was inspired by this, and so it was a change. So at what point do you restore it to its original look, or is this part of the lived history? And those are constantly a dialogue about those things. And then things like safety. Gauntlet is one of the first 4-player games, and this is some of the materials from here. And so they intentionally did not put plexi on there. But we had a host, is what we call people working the floor, cleaning the surface, got a mild shock, and was very alarmed. And so we said, okay, we're going to put some plexi on there. These sort of choices we make all the time. And I think one of the choices and this is true of arcade games, I think this is true of a lot of just digital preservation in general, is you always need to focus on the significant properties of the game. Because any degree of emulation, of migration, is going to involve making some changes. You're never going to have entirely that lived experience as it was in the beginning. And so choosing what are significant properties, is so important that you need to preserve that as well. It could be as simple as a keyboard layout, for instance, in an emulated game. Is that important or not if you have migrated it? And then we began to create exhibits, permanent exhibits. So our eGame Revolution exhibit is right here, and this replaced what was open storage, not very play-related. Flow Blue China was not very popular with guests. Got taken out and replaced by video games. It was sort of a no-brainer in terms of popularity. But we also were very interested in connections between older forms of play and newer forms of play. So this is Will Wright's Dollhouse, Will Wright's Notebooks for The Sims. We compared it to a dollhouse. How is that play similar? And that was really important. And I think exhibitions are useful to think about because, again, I think you need to think of preservation in terms of how does it benefit the institution. In this case, having the exhibits help generate support internally for the preservation activities. And they can't exist in isolation from one another. And so they need to be shared. But then we face this broader question of how do you preserve a video game? What does that mean? And so we went through a thought exercise. Well, this is where I bring in the classical stuff from my father. This is a Roman papyrus, and this is like a sort of a vellum manuscript codex. And this is Monte Cassino in Abbey in southern Italy, which is one of the foremost libraries of literature in the Middle Ages, also about a stone's throw from where my grandparents came from Italy, so that's up there for that reason too. But it's a good example of text. We've long migrated stuff from one form to the other. This is nothing new. And so we said, okay, if this is true, okay, this is what we can do. We're open to this possibility. So this is for the history of books, how you might do it. Similarly, for the history of movies or film, again, something that right here, there's a lot of expertise on, much more than I do. But it's a fairly straightforward process in many ways compared to, say, preserving a sporting event. What does that mean to preserve a sporting event? And is it a video of the match? Is it the uniforms that people played? Is it the program that they might have purchased? Is it the oral histories? It's a more complex thing. And so for us, video games are a lived experience. They're a played experience. And so what does that mean to preserve that beyond this game? And as we see with things like the growth of MMOs, massively multiplayer online games, preserving a game absent the community that is invested in it, it may be meaningless. It may not yield very much in terms of useful information. So we thought about this and really thinking not so much even how do you preserve these things, but how do you preserve the history of them. So this is sort of where we've come to in terms of how to preserve the history of video games as opposed to just preserving video games. And I think that wider lens has allowed us to take a sort of multi-pronged approach. And so I mentioned here some different things that we've done. So certainly original hardware and software, we have plenty of those. Library archival materials that document things. We have something like, I think, 20 to 30,000 computer and game magazines, for instance. Media about game. And the archival materials I mentioned, again, the collections. And those are the things that are most used by scholars, are the archival materials that come from around the world. Much more than the games we found, which is interesting, which is not what we would have thought in the beginning. Video capture. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Actually recording video play. Source code, and of course, migration emulation. And this is a constantly expanding list as we try to solve this question, how do you preserve the history of video games as opposed to just preserving video games? This was, we received a major grant, one of our first initiatives, to do video capture using original equipment of games from before 2005, and we did about more than 4,000 games. And it was like a dream job for these students at RIT because they got to play video games all day and capture it. And it was a good example, though, however, too, of building partnerships. So we work with Rochester Institute of Technology, which is a local university, and they supplied a lot of the technical skills that we didn't have at that point. And it was, so a good lesson in that, in developing partnerships. And I know, again, that was some of the conversation this morning from the roundtable. But it's also, I think, a program that was a mixed success. On the one hand, we gained a lot of technical facility. We did video capture for more than 4,000 games. But we didn't think about the long-term digital storage as much. We did some. There was some in there. But probably not enough as we needed. We didn't think critically about what video formats to use. We were sort of going with less information than we should have. We should have consulted earlier with leaders in the field. And this is something that I think is often forgotten and think about preservation, but how are you disseminating this stuff? This is something we still struggle with. So 70,000 or so of the objects in our collection, you can read about them when you go to Google Arts and Culture. We had dreams to sort of put the video up there for a lot of these games as well, and we've never done it. We've gone through a succession of different people involved in that. And then the question is, should we even be in this business of doing this anymore? With like YouTube and Twitch and the other things, are we the right people to be doing this, or are there other better uses of our time? So this is, again, I think something, always assess if what you're doing is the right thing to be doing, if you should still be doing it, or is someone else doing it better? We work, for instance, very closely with the Internet Archive and Jason Scott. They're doing a lot of stuff with scanning magazines. We don't want to get into the business of scanning magazines because they're doing it. And so know what others are doing so you're not duplicating efforts because everyone has scarce resources. And then we began to realize, well, how about all this born digital materials? How do we do this? So this is, just to give you an example, very, very close to home example for us. This is a game, Pigs to Clover. If any of you grew up playing those games where you roll the ball around, in the back, keep the kids busy in the backseat of the car and try to get into a maze. Well, this is the first of those games. Came out in the 1880s. Created a scandal in Washington, D.C. because the presidency of Benjamin Harrison, all the cabinet was wasting their time playing pigs and clover rather than doing the work of the country. And we have an amazing collection of these games. We said, well, let's make a digital version of this. And so we worked again with partners. And so we actually ported a lot of these games over the last 140 years to mobile platforms and to the Nintendo Switch. So if you have the original mobile game, you can download it for free. If you want to buy the expansion pack, you'll add 99 cents or so to the coffers of the museum. But it's a great example. But ironically, it's going to be a lot easier in many ways for us to preserve this original game from the 1880s than it will be to preserve this digital version that we created ourselves. And so what do we need to do this? How do we have the staff on tap to do that? So that led us to hire our first digital games curator. Again, recognizing that there was a need here and we needed to devote the resources as an institution to doing this. He was someone who brought with him a real passion. He was already doing preservation activities. And this is another one of those things where working with private individuals are often the ones that are at the forefront of digital preservation. So he's been really key. But staff members, so Julie, our archivist, who's peeking behind this 8-inch floppy. So if anyone has a good 8-inch floppy device for migrating information from there, please talk to me because we're much better off for 5 1/4 and 3 1/2. The staff has gained resources. This is the CryoFlux. Does anyone use the CryoFlux at all? Or Applesauce is another one that's just come out recently. We're using that as well. But migrating this thing, or you're doing ROM dumps for for arcade games, you need to develop this expertise, and it's one project at a time. It's one of the things is each of these requires a different set of expertise to do these things. And so there's tremendous cost. And again, probably you all know this, but I think just not counting long-term storage, I think it's like $12 for us to migrate one piece of software from, say, a 5 1/4-inch disk. If you figure out staff time, setup time, all that sort of stuff, onto things. So you have the cost of acquiring, just the skills, the time to learn how to access the original game. It was funny watching these modern students try to play old games from the 1980s. They had no idea what to do. It was sort of the reverse of me trying to play Call of Duty with my kids or something like that. So you need to master the tools to migrate it. You need to migrate the data. And I know in the archival world, there are charts that lay this out in a much more sophisticated way. But you also need to think of long-term storage, the backup file, and then again, the management and tracking of the digital assets. Again, one of those things, as a collection grows, and for us, that's a huge challenge. And so our sort of way of approaching this was we developed this acronym, which we called RAVE. We said for items that are rare, at risk, valuable, and engaging. And we sort of thought of it like a hospital emergency room, as a triage ward. If you have a sprained wrist, you're going to wait for a while, at least in the US. I don't know about here in Australia. If you're having a heart attack, they'll get you in fast. And so we would have to look at and say, okay, we have 60,000 games. We can't do this all. We just don't have the resources to do this. So what do we need to prioritize? And so for us, for instance, it might be archival items. So for instance, this right here, this is Andrew, our digital games curator. So this is an early build. There's a game, did anyone ever play the game Age of Empires? Okay, yeah, so one of my favorite games of all time. So we have Bruce Shelley was the designer of Age of Empires, and he had donated his personal papers. And we found this early build of Age of Empires on there. So Andrew he does a Twitch stream called Game Saves from the Strong every once in a while. But this is an early build. So we thought, okay, this fits this criteria. It's rare, it's one of a kind, it's at risk, it was on a disk, a floppy disk, it's valuable. And valuable, we mean not necessarily monetarily valuable, but more culturally valuable. This was a significant game, and it's engaging. The public might find this interesting. And so this is sort of our criteria. And so it tends to focus on, for instance, then we'll look at, okay, what are the most at-risk forms of media in our archives as opposed to the mass-produced games? Okay, look, a CD-ROM that was burned on a home computer is much more at risk than a CD-ROM that was burned in a factory. Sort of a die-based one's much more risk than those burned in a factory. So how do you do this level of triage here? We found this a very useful thing for prioritizing scant resources and figuring out what to do first. And I think this is something that we're all going to have to do. I mean, this is, and I'll mention at the end, we live in an age of abundance, and this, again, came up in this morning's session. There's so much material being documented. Hundreds of thousands of video games are being made every year. If you look at something like Global Game Jam, for instance, has students all over the world, or people all over the world producing games. What does that mean to produce? There's no way we're going to preserve all these unless you can form certain alliances. So you need to make these choices. And I think the archives here, for instance, are focusing first on, 8 games, I believe, right? The 8 Australian-based games. You can't do everything here, so you always have to make those choices. But then you also need to keep track of things. So this is another example of what I was talking about where we adapt existing models. So as a museum, we have a policy that twice a year, the computer spits out 100 random objects out of our collection of 500,000 objects, and we need to go find those objects. And we need to report this back. And we do it once internally, and then our auditors do it as well. So we said, what if we took this idea and adapted it for our electronic game collection? So twice a year, the computer spits out 100, or actually more than 100, because sometimes things won't be an actual game, they'll be something else. And we said, we need to track down 100 games. We not only need to find them, but we also need to see if they work. And so, so you'll see here, for instance, this is from one of our early ones. You'll see that the game title, this is the number, the object number, the game title, the platform, and then what the category is, and found and working, is it working or no? And so what we're hoping with this is, A, it will be sort of like an early warning detection system. Like, hey, are we starting to lose our 5.25-inch floppies? They're going downhill fast. Because they really, and there's some data on longevity of media properties, but I think for computer stuff, I'm not sure if we really know exactly how long everything is going to last. And I think some things surprise us. And then you get surprises for, so the Madden NFL 2004, these were commercially available games. There's been no reason these shouldn't work. But for some reason, whatever in the production, this is over here. Something weird with, this is what Andrew wrote, with Madden 04, tested 2 different Xboxes, but half the copies didn't work. So we sort of get this data. And it also is a way for us not only to see how's the collection holding up, but do we have the resources? So especially, for instance, for computers, do we have the computers that have the necessary hardware and software in them to run these games? Do we have redundant systems, hardware systems to run these things? This is all presupposing that we want to keep the original systems running as long as we can. And so this is sort of a check on us to make sure, are we doing our job? Are we keeping up? And what lessons can we learn? Hopefully stuff that we can share with the field going forward. And being random sort of keeps us honest a little bit. I would say another way, actually, is just researchers coming and wanting to play games. So they'll ask for something, then we realize, oh no, wait a second, we have 5 TRS-80s and none of them work, that sort of thing. So you find those things. But this is something that I think we found very useful for this ongoing thing. And we're also preparing a lot of manuals, both for internal and then hopefully soon publishing on our website, in sort of open version of this. And we actually have 2 of these different manuals that are sort of, they're both processes, but also into technical stuff as well. And you'll see my name is not on here at all because they don't let me do any of that stuff, really. So that brings me to this point. Again, this is something that you probably all know if you've done digital preservation. It's never over. We were talking earlier about, do you have we think about a 100-year time horizon. Well, realistically, you're not doing anything that's going to last 100 years. You're doing something that's going to maybe last 5 more years or 10 more years or 20 more years. In that time period, you're going to have to maybe go back and figure out how to do that again. And so, but in the process of doing that, you build institutional knowledge to go back and do that more. So I want to think about some key problems for the future. And these, again, are nothing surprising. And then I just thought at the end, just talk a little bit about some of the exhibits we've done, just because I thought there might be some relevance. So I've already mentioned, first, the challenge of born digital. And so what does this mean? So this is a Flappy Bird. Some of you may remember. It was a huge hit, and then the developer took it down. But what happens when you have a game, as I've alluded to already, that's an MMO, that is relying on a community of people, or that has digital rights management software on that, and the company chooses to shut the server down? What happens then? How do you go about sort of preserving that history? And this is, again, where I think that preserving the history, as opposed to always preserving the game, is important. And you may develop relations with some of these developers, but you may not. So how do you do that? And I've already alluded to this. How do you, do preservation in the age of abundance? With so many games coming out, this is part of our board game collection. And that came about because the Industrial Revolution and the Transportation Revolution brought this huge upsurge in the production of board games. Well, the challenges are so much more magnified now. And so it's something where we are going to inevitably need to pick and choose. We're not going to be able to do everything. And then what about a game like Ingress or something like that? That's a location-based game, or Pokemon Go. What does it mean to preserve that anyway? We just actually, a guy in Sweden just sent us a bunch of videos because Ingress, which was sort of the forerunner of Pokemon Go in many ways, they were changing the sort of the build of the game. They were updating it. And those who were wedded to the old build wanted to preserve something. They sent a lot of videos of them playing in these locations in Sweden. But that's one way of preserving it. So how do we do that? VR is another one. And again, I know there are efforts here. AR in some ways may be more problematic than VR, I think, because the physical landscape will change. So how do you keep alive a history of that? And then how will collaboration happen? And this is a theme, I think, that is happening here in Australia already. What does it mean when each of us as institutions have our own ways of doing things? How do we come together to work together? And I think that collaboration, for me, always needs to happen through these sort of conversations that are happening here at this conference. And I think it's happening between the producers, the game development community. Again, I know the archives are in conversation with people here, the people who are creating these 8 games that they're preserving. We're in constant dialogue with people in the video game industry. Sometimes those are productive, sometimes, frankly, they're not, because the game developers are more focused on getting the next game out. With scholars, I think this is really important because they're your best lead as to the questions that are important to preserve around. When you have materials like, what is the world of players like? That led us, for instance, to acquire a set of fanzines from the 1990s. It was a pretty amazing collection, sort of collection that scholars ask. Or what's the experience of users? So focus group sort of documents have been very popular with scholars. So what are the questions that scholars ask? And that, in turn, will drive what things you choose to preserve, because, again, this is about choices. Consumers, and this is both consumers in general, but also, I think, consumers of your particular institution, whether that's people who come to your place of your museum, or scholars, or maybe it's the government, or whoever's funding you. To some extent, they're consumers. And then other institutional individual preservationists. Again, I can't stress that enough. The individuals are so key doing a lot of this work out there, so creating those relationships. And then with video games, it's even more complex because there's this constant conversation with the technology. As I've talked about here, preserving an arcade game is very different than preserving a 5¼ floppy, which is very different than preserving a CD-ROM, which is very different than preserving an augmented reality game on your smartphone. They all have their own generations of challenges. And so doing that requires persistence. It feels like I'm like an inspirational poster here or something like that, kitten hanging from a sort of wall or something like that. But it is something that we all need to be in. But I also think it's important to cultivate then as well, again, these constituencies. Who are the constituencies in your case that are going to give you the resources to do these things that you have to do? And for us, the public is a key area of this. So I just throw some quick slides of different exhibits that we've done just to wrap up here. And I'd be happy to take a few questions. So one of the things we do is, as part of cultivating key individuals in the community, is putting their materials on exhibition for the public to see. So this is John Romero, the co-creator of Doom, who donated. This is Ken Williams. This is Jerry Lawson, who was the guy who sort of was key in developing the cartridge, the video game cartridge. So putting these out as a way to let people from the industry know, hey, your stuff's just not going to disappear. It's very important to them. So you can find ways to do that. We also began to create exhibits because that would help on the budget side. Boardwalk Arcade, we actually you could win tickets. I don't know if you have these in Australia here, and get prizes. So I became like a carny operator here, seeing how many tickets was this machine generating. But it was an important way for us to actually help offset some other costs and also build a way to get more of the collection out. We try a lot to connect, say, for instance, the design documents with the actual games. There's some challenges, for instance, arcade games, so you get sort of valley effects. So sometimes from exhibit display, it doesn't always work that well because guests tend not to go back there. It's something we discovered. And then we did a permanent pinball playfields exhibit. This is some of the oldest pinball games, and that's on permanent display at the museum, along with our E-Game Revolution. We launched the World Video Game Hall of Fame. You can play with scale. That's always fun. Something like this giant Nintendo we had there. projected. Guess love that. We published a book as well, A History of Video Games and 64 Objects. And then we wanted to explore deeper themes. And again, your institution will have its own particular ways of looking at things. We're looking at it from a lens of play. So exhibit like Rockets, Robots, and Ray Guns, looking at science fiction. Have a Ball was looking at the role of the ball, everything from a ball from the 17th century, dug up from the Thames River, to a game like Breakout or Sphero, which is a robotic ball. So how these big themes. We work with Ritsu Making University in Japan, so again, this collaboration, and also with Nintendo to do this exhibit on the 30th anniversary of the Nintendo Entertainment System. And then other exhibits, so again, ways to bring out the collections and themed areas, and often tied in with new collections like for the Oregon Trail, which is a popular game in the United States. We worked with a local airport, so we actually have, if you go through the Rochester airport, so all of you come to visit the museum now, we have a World Video Game Hall of Fame, including this giant version of Pong you can play that's out there. And our Women in Games initiative, which is actually one of 5 collecting initiatives we have that are focused. But we did things with like Lara Croft, for instance, giving guests a chance to react. And this is from when the exhibit is open now. We reproduced these. And this whole area behind Lara Croft is now covered with Post-it notes. What are people's reactions to the way that Lara Croft is depicted, women in general are depicted in video games? And we're planning a major expansion. And so this is 2 major exhibits. High Score and Level Up are the tentative titles. Level Up here, right here. And this will be treating games through the lens of art, play, story, and business, technology, and society. And this one, you'll actually be going into the game, and you'll actually be getting an avatar. You'll be earning achievements and badges as you play different things, as you learn about the history of video games. And none of this may look nothing like this when it's all said and done. So that's sort of part of our story there. That's sort of how we came sort of accidentally into preserving video games. It's something that, as I try to share, we've made mistakes along the way, learned things, adopted a lot of things. But it's a story, I think, of what I think any institution can do when you find how preserving digital materials relates to your core mission and find creative ways to do it. And it's been a lot of fun, and I'm sure we'll make a lot more mistakes, but I appreciate the chance just to share some of those experiences with you right now. Thank you so much. Is there time for questions?
That was amazing, JP. Thank you so much. Some questions from the room. Before we start with the questions, the token that you were presenting, I was thinking of that, and reminded me of when I was 15 in 1982, and we played arcade games in snack bars, and we used to use these Dutch guilders, let's say $1, and then we found out that 50 lira pieces from Italia, the equivalent of 2 cents, actually did the job as well. So these tokens are still viable for you guys?
These tokens are, yes. I don't know about lira coins, if you can get them as maybe some Milan or somewhere there somewhere.
You could play for weeks without paying anything.
Yes.
Okay, so that was amazing. Before we start the questions, are there questions in the room already? Yeah, here.
By the way, Australian 10-cent pieces work as quarters.
Yeah, there you go.
We've been working with video game preservation in our company for a while, and one of the traps we've found with coming across the digital is making sure you've actually got everything that was on that original device. So, for instance, with the Laserdisc-based games, we found that a lot of the Laserdiscs are starting to rot, and so initially we started just extracting the video from those Laserdiscs, and then with the plan of emulating later. And then down the track we found there's a whole bunch of hidden information on those discs that nobody knew was there, that only came up in certain circumstances or was actually hidden code where people put their signatures in there and that sort of thing. So we switched to then scanning the entire disc from start to finish to pick up everything that was on that disc, and in theory you could then make another Laserdisc from that, and that would pick up the error correction, all these other bits and pieces. And that's something we're finding in more and more fields. Is that something that you've come across so far?
Yeah, definitely. So I definitely think that discovering stuff that you didn't expect to be there as you sort of migrate more of that data off there. We see the same thing with arcade games, for instance, or hidden code. And it's something that a digital games curator could probably give you some like great other examples of that. But again, it's always this challenge too of, if you've taken it off, what's the significance of it? And it may be very significant or it may be insignificant. And sometimes you choose, how much effort do you want to put into that because there may be, or sometimes you're like, well, that's something we're just going to miss or whatever else. One of the things about the video game community specifically is that people are so passionate about it that they're discovering all these. So we learn so much from people who have discovered these things on their own, and we're constantly learning much more from them than I think probably than we discover ourselves. And that's again really important for this community. But there's a lot of that, and oftentimes you discover, or a company will donate. This has happened to donate hardware to us, like development hardware, and we'll find their builds for games that were never released on there. I'm like, okay, what do we do with this now? We are very, I didn't talk about IP, and we're very respectful of IP in terms of, and that's something that different institutions have different levels of comfort with, I think. So again, something like the Internet Archive, they take a looser interpretation of what's, generally when people sign a deed of gift, we will not say release stuff out there. We get a lot, for instance, we have source code. We'll get a lot of people, especially from the MAME community, who want us to release stuff out in the wild, and we feel like that's not our role as our institution where we are. So, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Thanks. I was going to ask about rights. Have you had any issues from the owners of the games in terms of exhibiting them with rights? And secondary, you talk about a community and individual preservationists. Do you also deal with people like pirates and crackers and hackers and emulator designers in order to preserve those games?
This is where I ask again if this is being recorded or not. So first of all, in terms of answering your first question, we generally, and I don't know the rules and laws in Australia. In the US, we abide by what we consider fair use within the museum context. And so we will feature things in exhibits that are playable, and we haven't had trouble with that. But it's sort of a case-by-case basis. Sort of like showing video. When you're showing video from Disney, you sort of give it a little extra thought because you know how litigious they are. So you want to, what's your relationship with the company? Do you have a relationship where you can call them up? But we generally consider most of that is within fair use. In terms of working with the communities of hackers or crackers or anything else, people doing, that is an important community in terms of moving forward research on how to preserve these games. Generally, again, institutions, in my experience, we're like the cargo ships carrying stuff along. We're not the fast ships that can move forward. And within the U.S., the latest Library of Congress exemption for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act give you some leeway with that, but some not. It didn't go as far as some people wanted it to go. And that was being brought forward. People trying to revive one of the first MMOs actually were working with these people who are outside. They're trying to basically bring people in as calling them almost like museum consultants, but they weren't being paid. And so the Library of Congress said, well, no, you can't really do that. But again, a lot of it is how are you showing games. So there's definitely a relationship. It's a complicated relationship with those communities, but you have to be engaged with them too. So.
Thanks, JP. You talked quite a lot about play and the physical artefacts, and that was very much part of the museum's objective. So I'm just interested, when you do the digital preservation from the floppies or the CD-ROMs, is the ability to play the the object that's been digitally preserved, is that part of that objective as well, so that you can play the game in another format?
Yes, but probably not for most of our guests, because one of the things we discovered too is that for the general museum exhibit guests, they're not interested in many of the games. So if a researcher came, we would want to make sure that that material was playable, like that the Rise of Man, the Age of Empires build that I showed. So if a researcher came, we want to make that a playable for them. One of the things we discovered for guests is that those of you who've done exhibits, is that certain games don't work well and certain games do. So this may be a little bit of a tangent, but so for instance, I mentioned earlier text-based adventures, a game like Zork. That was some of the first games I played. I love text-based adventures. The general museum visitor does not love text-based adventures. And so that was like an utter failure when we put it out there. Generally for a museum, it needs to be something quick, so long-form computer games generally don't work as well as say an arcade game or something like that. And again, that's sympathy to the guest to your institution, who is, if they're a general public, they're probably coming in a family and they want to pull them away. They don't want them in a 6-hour marathon session or something like that. But definitely for researchers, the goal is to make these playable for researchers. But again, what's actually available for the public is another question too there. So I think over here.
I was just curious as how you deal with patches and mods for games. Like the original vanilla version might be very different to a version 10 years ago, which has 20 patches in it or whatnot.
Right, yeah. That's an incredibly tough question. I mean, sometimes you can maybe try to isolate something on original hardware, but a lot of things now just have automatic updates. So you need to think about first of all, are your things hooked up to your wireless network or not? You want to make sure that maybe they're not, so they're not just getting updated automatically through the server. Documentation is the best thing I can say. Is if you can say this was, sort of downloaded at this time, and it was it was turned off or something, and maybe hopefully it'll be playable later. If there's a server that the company chooses to shut down, then it won't be playable anyway. And this is where I think the model of architectural preservation is useful again for me. Just as with arcade games, I think you can make the same thing. Just as a house is constantly being updated, a game's now constantly being updated. And so what are you documenting? What period are you documenting at that point? But it's an extremely hard challenge, and one that's only going to get harder. Especially now, you talk about like a Stadia or some of the other sort of gaming as service things. What does that mean when it's a service that you're not even downloading a copy of the game anymore? You're just playing it live. So again, documentation is just really important, I think, in the main thing. This is what it is. But maybe at that moment you may need to do video capture, and that maybe might be where that would be useful at that moment for that. But yeah, great question, and something that I wish I had a easy answer for, but there isn't one. So.
Hi, I was just wondering if you've done any thinking around preserving user-generated content, so things like Minecraft where people are building their own worlds, or there's lots of games where users actually create levels for other users to play. Have you done anything around that, or only the original game as it comes from the developer?
That's really important to us. So if you remember that concentric circles, that players was one of those. So getting at exactly those sort of artifacts is really important to us. So we just had an intern working in the speedrunner community, for instance, trying to document some of that. And I mentioned, for instance, like the fanzines. The challenge is it's harder sometimes to do that. You almost need to pick your battle. Say like, okay, this is a community we think is important for this reason, so therefore we're going to document something around there. But yeah, that's really important, and one that I think we have the goal of doing that much more maybe than we actually get around doing. It's a lot easier for someone to donate, 500 games than it is maybe to take the time to go out and really sort of scrape the internet for something that reflects a certain communities. And we do have, what we'll do is we'll have certain targeted sort of initiatives, and then we'll maybe try to focus on that as well. And the same thing is true with the history of technology. So for instance, we're doing right now with Flash games, for instance, where if you're familiar with the history of Flash, really important, a lot of games during that, during especially the sort of 90s into the aughts. And Flash is being basically going away, and so we're working with a group, we're going to announce that soon, to do a major preservation of about 10,000 Flash games, hopefully. But it's interesting, we don't know, like, how we're going to preserve that for 100 years too. We know we can how to preserve it for 10 years with the hardware, but beyond that, we're buying ourselves time, I think, a lot of times. So.
In your experience, games creators and producers, do they see any cultural value or historical value in the output that they produce? Or do they even think about preservation from their own perspective? Or is it like their eyes light up when you approach them and say, hey, we actually want to preserve your game? Have they thought about it before?
Yeah. So in terms of the creator's commitment to preservation, it varies a lot. So if you have a big company like Electronic Arts, EA, or Activision, they will have robust sort of internal processes for preserving their games. Now, there are a lot of horror stories out there, the companies that turned out not to have robust, and so they're trying to, calling up ex-employees saying, hey, do you still have that hard drive? But there was actually a talk at the Game Developers Conference this past from the guy who leads digital preservation at EA. That was useful if anyone's interested in that. A place like Activision Blizzard, again, they have key places. When you start getting to other companies, what I've found from working with a lot of companies is founder-driven companies and developers are often very passionate about that. But a company that's been around for a while and someone's just come on, they're working 3 years at this company and then they're going 3 years to that company, they may not have that same level of commitment in comparison, and I can understand this, to the need to get the next game made or to meet the next quarterly profit. And so I think you're going to have your best luck working with people who made the games themselves. Indie games are a great possibility here because those are often passion fueled and they're still young enough and they feel honored to be thought of. Or we've had great luck working with the developers or the founders of studios. So someone like Doug Carlson, who founded Broderbund, for instance, donated all his papers to the museum because they're less worried about, for instance, confidentiality, but they're like, I created this company. What are they going to do to me? And whereas someone who's more sort of is a stepping stone as part of a larger career, they're generally more cautious and more concerned about what the next quarterly profits are. So it really varies a lot. But I would recommend going for those people who are likely to have an interest. So local developers probably, indie developers, again, founder-driven companies. Those are ones that you're probably going to get your best responses from as opposed to a big multinational corporation where you're probably going to be shifted off to a marketing person who be like, why am I helping you do this? How is this going to help sales? So, yeah. So
thanks. Just one very last question from my side. You were mentioning in an age of abundance, you'll have to be selective, and you were mentioning your RAVE model, rare, at risk, valuable, and engaging.
Yeah.
Valuable, engaging sounds a bit subjective. Is there a role for the digital curator there? Because you'll probably still end up with a lot of items to be preserved. How do you deal with that?
I think it is very subjective, and it's just there. You're hopefully relying on the knowledge of the curator who's making those choices, and also funding too. So sometimes you can get funding. But for instance, these are not games, but we had a large collection of U-matic tapes from Atari that show things, very funny song and dance routine that Atari put on, like a whole Broadway musical celebrating the successes of Atari, 1 year before they went in the toilet and buried 100,000 cartridges in a New Mexico landfill. So, but that was one we could get funding for. But you do have to rely on the sort of knowledge of the curators, I think, as well as, again, those conversations with larger communities to see what is important, because those are inherently subjective terms. So.
Thank you, JP. Big round of applause for JP, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jon-Paul.